Enga iwi, enga mana, enga waka, enga hui whā, haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. Raurenga tira mā, tēnā koutou, ka nui ta haere ko haere mai no koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. A very good morning, folks. Great to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us here for our webinar this morning. This is Resilience and the Role of Cooperative Enterprise in a Post-Pandemic Rebuild. And that sounds like a very heady sentence, but it gets right to the crux of the matter. And we know this, and you've certainly seen this from the information that we provided for you here prior to the webinar, that this situation hasn't created inequality, but it's really very much highlighted it for us. And because we've been able to see that level of inequality, the platform, the playing field is absolutely ripe for a change in how we do business, how we approach the most vulnerable members of our society, and how we can be a much more inclusive nation. So we have with us 5 fantastic panelists who will be talking to us around some of the elements of this, of resilience and the role of cooperative enterprise. We have coming to us very, very shortly indeed, Jackson Rowland, who's Director of Akina Invest, Kay Marie Dunn, who's a facilitator for Te Whare Hukahuka, or the Innovation House, Māori Development Specialist, Stephen Moy, who is a partner for Parryfield Lawyers and also hosts the Seeds podcast for the charitable sector, Ros Henry, CEO of Co-op Business New Zealand, and rounding out our panel, we have Vaughan Winiata, who is the founder and MD of V-Formation and an SME evangelist. We also have with us the instigator of this particular webinar, and that's Ross McTaggart, and he directs Core Enterprise Group. And it's really his vision in terms of let's get a conversation going in this time about how we can harness the power of cooperatives for our society. So we'll get ourselves underway and kick it off here with our first presenter this morning, and that is Jackson Rowland. Jackson, take it away.
Thank you very much, Greg. Kia ora tātou. My name is Jackson. So as Greg mentioned, I work for the Akina Foundation. Akina is an organisation. Our purpose is to really transform the New Zealand economy to have it more impact focused, particularly through the power of business and small business. We really want to enable them to grow their impact, and in doing so, grow the well-being of New Zealand. We do that in a few key ways. So impact-oriented consulting is one key part of the business, working with organisations from listed companies right through to start-up newer organisations to help them better understand their impact and manage and improve that. We also do a lot of social procurement work. So we've launched a marketplace there to enable large purchasers, procurers of goods and services to procure from social enterprises where possible to unlock the impact that the social enterprise creates when making that good or service. And finally, impact investment. So that's what I lead within the organisation. And our goal there is to really build the impact investing market in New Zealand. And it's with that hat on that I wanted to share a bit today about some work we did over the past couple of years to really explore legal structures in New Zealand and their suitability for impact-oriented organisations, which I know all cooperatives certainly are. So why we did that work right from the start was we've constantly heard from social enterprises and impact-oriented organisations that they've seen the existing legal structures in New Zealand as a barrier to their work. The legal structures don't explicitly contemplate impact or mission lock or really recognise what is fundamentally important to these organisations, which is that impact. So we've heard this for a number of years, and off the back of that, we started having conversations with government about that, and saying that there's a challenge for social enterprises with the existing legal structures, and having conversations about whether that was a case for change. Particularly because, as we all know, the impact-oriented organisations are significantly growing in number. There was an estimate done last year that there are over 3,000 in New Zealand already. And we really think this is continuing to grow and reflecting an international trend of more and more impact-oriented organisations. Those conversations with government led to them saying, okay, we hear you, but we're not sure if we agree with you. So can you please give us some examples of how social enterprises have been disadvantaged by the status quo legal structures. So off the back of that, Stephen Moe on this call and a number of other lawyers and an economic anthropologist, we all came together to answer just that question. How are impact-oriented organisations disadvantaged by the status quo? And we interviewed over 20 different stakeholders throughout the sector, primarily social enterprises, but also the likes of charity services and then revenue, accountants, etc., to really try and identify tangible examples of how these organisations were disadvantaged. And the outcome of that was that we really did find a number of disadvantages. Ultimately, where those disadvantages all lead back to is that it means it's more difficult for these sorts of organisations to access capital. That was a fundamental barrier because of the legal structures in New Zealand, which naturally results in those businesses really struggling to grow and innovate and really reach their potential that they absolutely have. What sits behind that ultimate barrier, if you like, the cause of that we found is that in New Zealand, there's a perceptual binary around what is possible in the business world. So on one end, we've got the company structure, limited liability company, that is specifically designed for profit-making purposes. And then at the other end, we have the charitable entity or charitable statuses that is specifically designed to do good. That is really familiar in New Zealand, and that's what we know. But as we're all aware on this call, there's a growing middle ground, if you like, a growing number of organisations that don't necessarily sit at either end of the spectrum. But there's no legal structure to recognise that specifically. And what that's leading to is confusion and mistrust when any organisation presents itself as sitting in the middle. That confusion and mistrust is a disadvantage from a consumer perspective. It puts some people off. Some customers don't think a charity will be able to give them a good enough quality product, for example. A business that's doing good, customers might think there's some mixed intentions there, and they may be misleading on what they're doing and why. So there's a number of examples of the confusion that causes. To get around that, businesses or impact-oriented organisations look for a way to lock their mission within the organisation to really demonstrate that the mission is integral to what we're doing. So therefore, you should trust us. Within New Zealand legal structures, there's no explicit way to do that, so that's really difficult. It leads to complicated workarounds, and lawyers like Stephen get involved to try and create a protected mission to deliver that trust. But what that does is it creates a complicated structure that deters investors. So it's just a messy workaround that ultimately is a barrier to accessing capital. So based on that was kind of our conclusion, and we shared that with the government, with the MB in particular, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, which has led to ongoing conversations since then, and really promising conversations, I should say. So we shared that conclusion, and they really importantly returned the advice, if you like, that yes, the limited liability company, which is by far the most popular legal structure in New Zealand, and from our work, really simple and effective structure, that whilst it doesn't explicitly acknowledge a purpose or a mission, if you like, nor does it prohibit it. And that was a really key point from MB, in that whilst that you can effectively create mission lock within a limited liability company in New Zealand by baking it into the Constitution, and there's nothing in the Companies Act that prohibits that. If you do put it in the Constitution, directors must then act in the best interests of the company, which is according to that Constitution. So there are existing solutions there, which I think a lot of New Zealand isn't aware of. And because of that, part of our work going forward is to create examples and grow the understanding of what you can do within the status quo, alongside continuing the conversation, which I'm sure we'll get into today, about should we be also looking at an alternative structure that better reflects the way of doing business now. We've got a wellbeing framework. How can we create a wellbeing legal structure, if you like, to really accelerate realizing that framework? Majority of businesses, I believe, are impact-oriented now. They're all starting with a broader purpose than just making profit. So how can we really enable and accelerate that in New Zealand? That's the long-term conversation, and a really exciting one that we're part of, but as no one will be surprised, COVID has been a bit of a disruption to those conversations and required officials who we're working with to look elsewhere temporarily. So our plan post-election, once things settle down within government, is to restart these conversations and determine whether there's a strong enough business case and enough benefit to New Zealand in creating a more aligned structure to deliver impact in New Zealand, and see where that leads. At the same time, we'll continue with that education on the status quo, because I do believe there's a lot of possibility there to realise what we're all trying to achieve. But it's certainly a journey, and there are really exciting opportunities for New Zealand. So that's probably enough of an introduction at this point, I'd say. Shall I hand back to you there, Greg?
Absolutely, and thank you very, very much indeed, Jackson Rowland. I'm really interested to hear that, putting a submission towards government, and you're having interesting conversations and continuing conversations, but I'm really interested to see what action steps and what might happen from that point there. So thank you very much indeed for sharing that, and particularly the work that you've done with Stephen as well, and certainly we'll probably delve more into that. For those who have not seen it, in the chat you will have found there is a paper that Jackson was speaking about. Stephen has just placed that up there for anyone of our attendees to be able to view as well. And this, of course, is a two-way street in terms of a webinar. We really want your input, so please do pose any questions. If there's a specific member of our panel whom you'd like to put that question to, just place their name within that question as well. That'd be quite valuable for us too. And our intention is to have as much time as possible for Q&A as we get towards the end of this webinar as well. So look forward to connecting in that way. Moving directly on to the next of our presenters here, coming to us as a facilitator for Te Whare Huka Huka, and also has a significant level of experience as a Māori development specialist. She's a founder of Aho, and if you've not had an opportunity to go and look at this phenomenal work that Kay Marie Dana is doing in this space, then please do at the conclusion of our webinar as well. And I'll pass it directly over to Kay Marie now as we get on the way with our second presenter. Kay, take it away.
Oh, kia ora tātou. And thank you, Jackson, for setting a nice frame for me to step into. I really appreciate the consideration of the structures that we have to utilise as small and medium enterprises and how they can be enablers, or up to this point in time have actually been quite difficult as waka to carry our aspirations forward as Indigenous impact generators. So thank you for the introduction as well, Greg. I have had the special privilege of being able to work alongside a range of different community groups, organisations and agencies to support Māori, Māori community development and Māori SME development, and also in the social enterprise space. So across all of those areas, I have seen a lot of cooperation. I've seen a lot of individuals and change makers in the regions that are just trying really hard to solve some very wicked problems, and really struggling to do so. Either A, because the policy that determines how funding is distributed from government to community is doesn't quite fit these community organisations, so there's some barriers there. Also, many of those change makers are also don't have the capacity to be able to reach the criteria that organisations require of them. So there's a lot of development work there, and then there's also the personal stuff as well. So how do I, as a business owner, have the confidence to put myself out there to sell my products and to also compete? So those are some of the real big challenges that I've seen in my observations. However, if I look at where we've come through as a result of COVID-19, I've also been privileged to see iwi come together for a united cause, which is to protect our communities against a hidden danger, but a very frightening one that could have potentially cost thousands of New Zealanders' lives. So I've seen communities mobilise very quickly. They didn't wait for permission from the state to take action. They just got on with it, and they got on with it through deploying volunteers to manage and control borders, to ensure that they were able to protect their communities directly from any threats from outside that could potentially infect their elders or their families. I've also seen tribes that may have ordinarily not worked collaboratively for a range of different reasons, but have been able to put their differences to the side for the common good of deploying services, water, food, access to shelter, and also access to health services. And these organisations did that through their own desire to protect their communities. And then I've also seen the development of online communities. I've been really, really lucky to see the development of Facebook groups through the Tautoko movement. Tautoko was all about supporting Māori businesses and Māori to buy Māori, buy local, support one another. The Tautoko Facebook movement has a regional presence in the Bay of Plenty, in Rotorua, into Taihawauru, which is the Wanganui, Palmerston North, Manawatu regions, and I manage the Tautoko page for Taitokero. And so amongst all of us, we've got probably close to 15,000 members inside that group. We were either promoting Māori business or support services that can really uplift and support Māori during this really difficult time. And then we've also seen a significant interest in Māori businesses nationally. So Go Māori has a directory of Māori businesses, and what's been very interesting is that this is the very first time where a whole lot of Māori businesses have come to light that we didn't quite know of before, because people are now starting to control their own narrative around who they are and what they do. So Go Māori is an online community, have nearly 40,000 supporters of their work. And then there's also another group called Buy Māori, which I think has about 20 to 30,000 members. So that's a big network of people that have come together as a result of COVID-19 to really support the SME sector and Māori-owned businesses. But what I also think is quite magical is we're also not just trying to support Māori buying from each other, but we're also saying, well, how can New Zealanders buy Māori as well as a result? So I'm really, really excited about what we can do online. And then also at the same time, Te Whare Huka Huka have been developing a e-commerce program called Ka Hao I Te Ao, where we're offering scholarships to Māori businesses that want to pivot into e-commerce, and mainly because the barrier to entry is low. The skills required to be able to successfully run an e-commerce store, rather than just kind of saying, hey, look, go online. You know, we're actually providing a step-by-step, hold your hand guide into that space. And then also in signing a partnership deal with Shopify, it also means that we have a global network of support to really assist and uplift Indigenous businesses to, again, not only make it easier for our own communities to buy, but also to help enhance Indigenous trade. All of that is quite significant because we do know that a recession is coming. And so we're also conscious that we're not waiting for the cavalry to save us. And I think that's a really significant point for New Zealanders to know that many Māori are just starting to assert and take control of the economic future through proactive cooperation and support of each other. So so it's that co-opetition type scenario, which I'm really, really excited about as a result. The other piece that I just wanted to mention was what is iwi? What are the iwi roles in economic recovery? And I've heard it in different forums, but I do think that New Zealand generally owe a significant debt to our tribal leaders in being proactive in protecting communities. And as a result, also, they're being very proactive in exploring how are these asset holders going to leverage their relationship with government and also local government to help create new jobs. So I'm really, really excited about the latest announcements through the Provincial Growth Fund, who are looking at marae restoration, riparian planting, the work that DOC has enabled to create green jobs and tree planting, restoration work. So all of that is going to help with the rebuild. However, the other component that we need to consider is, well, what is the framework and what is the future going to look like as a result? And so I've been watching the Lever Room and the work that they've been doing in developing a new, I guess, restorative approach to this economic recovery process. And inside of that particular framework, they have been very intentional about including mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge as an underpin inside the economic recovery process. And I think that's really interesting as a signal to the sector that, one, there is a commitment to treaty principles in this recovery process, that there is a recognition and an acceptance that Māori have a significant role to play in the recovery process. And I think that it's also an invitation to say, well, how are these organisations who want to cooperate and work collaboratively, which is fantastic rhetoric, but actually how do you step beyond that rhetoric and actually start to forge very powerful cooperative partnerships and relationships with iwi who are completely dedicated to the well-being of their own communities and their beneficiaries as well. So I guess my exit point here is I'm mindful about the current situation that we're sitting in. We're still not free of COVID, so therefore the ways that we engage and enact how we operate is going to be quite different. I don't think we should go back to the way things were. I think we're in a position to be able to change the way that we operate. I think that if organisations do not recognise or proactively work in partnership with iwi and with Māori organisations, it will be at your own, I won't say demise, but I think you will not benefit from the opportunity to relate and connect and enable iwi to do their work. And I think there's a great opportunity for relationship building there. And I think fourthly, how is mātauranga Māori or Māori practice and approaches, how might that also influence the way that your organisations are operating moving forward into the future? So yeah, happy to talk and really looking forward to the rest of the speakers this morning.
Thank you very much indeed, Kay Marie Dunn. I was reminded very strongly as we were talking around iwi and the response to COVID that element of shared adversity creates really high-performing teams. That's one of the basic tenets of it, and that's certainly something not only from an iwi perspective but also from a New Zealand-wide perspective. With that in mind, the playing field has never been more ripe for an opportunity here and being able to have a cooperative focus. And so this webinar right here is in the exact right place. So thank you very much indeed for your observations and for your comments. We are jumping directly now to Stephen Moe, who has had significant experience here in the charitable sector and the co-op sector, and has practiced law in various different locations around the world, an extremely well-travelled gentleman, and he joins us here for his observations as we're talking around resilience and the role of cooperative enterprise in a post-pandemic rebuild. Just a reminder, please feel free to post us some Q&A or any of the chat here as we're travelling through as well. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Right, kia ora koto, ko Stephen toku ingoa. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to Ross and to Greg and to the other panelists. I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts. Yeah, I'm really enjoying hearing what we've already heard so far. And I think there's a lot of potential to continue these conversations. So I'm grateful for the chance to share with you. As I've said, I work as a lawyer, but please don't judge me based on that. I've done a wide variety of things. I started my career really looking at for-profit businesses, helping banks and corporates. So I worked in Tokyo, London, and Sydney, and then came back to New Zealand about 4 years ago. Since then, I've really gotten involved in the social enterprise and impact area. And yeah, I'm happy to share with you my thoughts from a legal perspective. Just as a personal note, in the 1960s, my parents went to Chile in South America to help set up cooperatives for farmers. So in a way, I feel now like my life is echoing my parents, because they've been involved in this area for decades, you know, a long time ago. And I think that's important to recognize, is that cooperatives are not a new thing. We talk about it today. Sometimes it's not as well known maybe, but they've been going for a long time. So before I dive into that, I just wanted to say, I actually view us as being, and COVID has accelerated this, but I think that we are at a point where our paradigm shift, there are paradigm shifts of thinking happening. So I want you to imagine that you're at a function, and the person on your right says that they want to set a new group up to help ex-prisoners reintegrate back into society. Immediately, your mind is probably thinking charity, not for profit, doing this for the good. The person on your left says, I want to set up a cafe, and immediately your mind thinks business, profit, business plans. And I think what we're seeing now is that people are realizing that it's actually possible to integrate both the passion and the heart that comes from wanting to help others, for example, the ex-prisoners, with actually setting up a business that makes money and is sustainable. Because as Jackson was pointing out, there's kind of downsides of both of these models. If you go down the purely charitable route, there's a lot of hurdles to jump through. There's difficulty in accessing capital. And at the same time, if you go down the for-profit route, there's difficulties. But what we're seeing is that there's more of an integration where people are saying, well, actually, if I set up a cafe that employed ex-prisoners, I'm able to accomplish the mission that I want to and be sustainable in what I'm doing. So I think we're at this point where people are actually realizing that there are new ways of doing business and approaching business. And I think it's really exciting. But I also think it's part of a broader shift which is going on. So it's really important to identify that this is just one example of several things. So just really briefly, the first one I think is the rise of impact investing. And you're seeing this talked about a lot more, where investors are saying, sure, I could make interest by putting it on deposit with a bank, or I could have impact by investing in some new way of doing things. So you now have different funds which are rising up, which are actually about impact investing. So that's one example. The other is the term I mentioned before, social enterprise. And I view that just as a terminology or a phrase. It actually, to me, encompasses something bigger, which is about being articulate about what's our mission and our purpose, and how do we report on it. And then the other examples would be consumer choice. People are realizing that when they go to the supermarket, they can choose products which actually are ethically sourced and have impact. So those are just examples. And then within that sphere, if you like, cooperative enterprise is another example of how this can be done. It's interesting to me though, because to me, this is like vehicles. You know, if you went to buy a car, there would be a yellow car here that seats 4 people, and there's a 4-wheel drive one over there. So as a lawyer, I kind of look at the different legal structures as being like vehicles getting from A to B. So you're having to select which one is best. And unfortunately, there is no best vehicle, and you often have to modify things. And that's what the report that Jackson was mentioning goes into. You often have to tweak things. For example, limited liability companies, do you have to say what your mission and your purpose is? No, you don't. You can set it up with no constitution. You can do it within an hour. as opposed to a charity, you have to say what your mission and purpose is. So there are different types of vehicles, and I think cooperative enterprise offers a really compelling one. Originally, in New Zealand anyway, they've mainly been used coming out of the agricultural sector, in particular thinking like Fonterra or some of those bigger companies where the shareholders have a stake. But I'd love to see them used more and adapted, and that's what you need to do, is adapt them for different models, different ways of thinking, as people are more receptive and open to these new ways of thinking. So I'm not planning to say any more. I just wanted to introduce the topic and say that cooperative enterprises definitely should be more on the agenda and more as an option. But underlying it is this foundational shift which is happening in our society, which is really positive, that we're actually thinking more about how business can combine profit and purpose and do some good as well. So back to you, Greg.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. I certainly really love that thought process in terms of, as you say, setting up a limited liability company is really simple. It's basically a few clicks here and there and away you go, sign it off and it's done. But as you say, setting up a charitable enterprise is a far different story. But I also love that concept of just looking at it from a, if you've got a cafe that you're going to employ ex-prisoners in. It's a different level of thinking. It's a cooperative way of thinking. And if we can make a bit of a mind shift in people out there in the marketplace, then I think there's a very strong hope for our cooperative sector. And talking about cooperative sector, that's exactly where we're going to be going next here with the CEO of Cooperative Business New Zealand. If you may not know it, or you may already know it, that the cooperative sector provides a significant amount of GDP to New Zealand, and looking after the organisations or the interests of the organisations and their members falls on the shoulders of our next speaker. I'd like to introduce to you the CEO of Cooperative Business New Zealand, Ros Henry.
Kia ora. Thanks for the intro, Greg, and thanks, Ross, very much for inviting me to participate today. I guess what's quite interesting is seeing the co-op model at this point in time really coming to the fore as a solution to how we navigate these challenging times. And it's also quite timely. It's actually coming up for the International Cooperative Day in early March. So, and that's focusing on sustainability. So it is all nicely linked up. For those, just to give you a bit more background in terms of Cooperative Business New Zealand, we are the membership body representing New Zealand's member-owned businesses. So these organisations, as Greg said, generate around about 19% of New Zealand's GDP, but they are very little understood, which is quite challenging. So our members are, we've got the big companies themselves that are our members. We also work with startups, so we call them provisional members. We also have a lot of individuals who are advocates, so we work with quite a lot of academics from the universities and the like to inform various discussions. And then we also have members such as the likes of Stephen in the legal space or the financial space to support the establishment of these organisations. So the point that we had before about legislation, there's multiple legislation that co-ops can be established under. You know, you've got friendly societies, you've got credit unions, building societies, mutuals, cooperative companies and industrial providence societies. So it's very broad. I guess the key thing though that unites them is that they are for the benefit of their transacting members. And so you're either a supplier or a user of goods or an employee of those organisations. And that's quite different than a organisation earning profits off the back of external investors. So I guess right now we've got an opportunity. These organisations tend to come about as a result of adversity, and they are fundamental to the economy. So when we came into COVID, probably 95, almost 100% of our members were classified as essential services. And so you can just see how important they are in terms of how we get through this period. The other thing is we are very broad. One of our speakers spoke before about we focus very much in the agri and dairy space, but in terms of internationally, yes, we are very strong in those areas, but we have got multiple sectors that we can under the co-op model. So we already heard about Fonterra, and obviously we've got Alliance and Silverfern Farms and Balance and Ravensdown in terms of suppliers to those areas. In terms of financial services, you've got Co-op Bank, credit unions, FMG, horticultural area, we've got a lot of different organisations, and utilities even, a lot of utilities ones. But what's quite interesting is that people actually don't appreciate that the likes of Mitre 10, Foodstuffs, ITM, Interflora, Southern Cross, they're all cooperatives, so they're all member-owned businesses. And they're not there about generating profits for external investors. So it's been quite interesting just to try and do a lot of education in this space. So, and these businesses are some of the most successful businesses in New Zealand with the most amazing brands. So it's really important. In terms of these organisations, what's interesting from this conversation we're having today is that they're made up of individuals or SMEs. So that's quite critical to how these organisations succeed, is the coming and get together. And I think that's what's quite exciting in terms of how we navigate COVID. You know, there's opportunity for butchers, bakeries, you know, primary sector suppliers to get involved and actually come together, collaborate and work together for the greater good. Just in terms of politics, you know, quite often people say, oh, you know, co-ops sit in this area or that area. I think the reality is it doesn't matter what people's political allegiances are at the end of the day. They are going to be critical to the survival of our economy. And I think there's a recognition internationally that, you know, the capitalism has taken its toll, and we really need to move to a different way of doing business. So one of the things that we are trying to do, so I've recently come into this role, and I'm very aware that there's a lot more that we could be doing in terms of the Māori space. And I'm currently working with MSD to see what areas that we should be touching on in that area. We are also working with the university, so I'm looking at setting up a partnership with Massey University. You know, a lot of people come out of education and don't actually understand the business model, which is crazy considering that 19% of GDP is coming from these organisations. So, and it's really neat to meet all of the people here today, because I think there's lots of opportunity for us to partner to support the establishment of these organisations. So that's just us in a nutshell, and some of the things that I think we have the opportunity to influence and change and would like to support.
Fabulous stuff, Roz. Thank you very much indeed. And really interesting, one of the points that jumped out at me was in terms of elements of capitalism. You know, we are constantly striving to say capitalism is the be-all and end-all. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of what we're seeing in the United States with this incredible yin-yang aspect of capitalism is fantastic, socialism is really bad, when in actual fact, there's a really beautiful middle ground of that that Stephen was alluding to as well. So some great elements that we can move on to discuss as we get to the chat section of our seminar. Sorry, keep saying seminar, our webinar here. So we'll move to our final speaker here in this particular session, and this is Vaughan Winiata, who's the founder and managing director of V Formation. He's had many leadership roles in various different organisations, and now works specifically from a values-based perspective in terms of the business that he does. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say around our concept here, resilience and the role of cooperative enterprise in a post-pandemic rebuild. Hand it over to you, Vaughan Winiata.
Kia tātou, everybody. And yep, Vaughan Winiata is my name. V Formation is the company that I run. And despite having an extensive corporate background, mainly with Japanese companies, I've ended up in the SME space at the latter end, I would say, of my career. And Greg, you're quite right. Values-based practice within a business model is something that I'm passionate about, and it has just become a matter of involvement that Māori values have been something that I've been able to integrate in that as a part of the journey. And I think that as far as arriving at where we're here today and talking about the small business community and Māori business, You know, we've all just had this crisis we've gone through and been knocked off our bikes or our horses or whatever, dusting ourselves off and trying to figure out where from here, or for want of a better word, you know, if we're in our walkers, what direction do we paddle in now? And the truth is that it couldn't be at a more critical time, in the sense that we're coming into a general election. When you scrutinise the rhetoric and what's coming out of our parties, they don't have much more idea than we do. So we're going to have to figure out a lot for ourselves. But at the same time, as a small business community, and particularly the Māori sector, we're going to need to be forthcoming with our government. And so that's a role that I've decided to step into and lead at the moment through V-Formation, which is to try and create a voice with government in the sense that we're not there to moan or raise issues. We really want to show that we are a community that's intelligent, articulate, and prepared to try and bring ideas to the beehive that might be something that we can work with. Because the history of small business in New Zealand is, and I think that this is where the SME sector, and to be frank, Māori are very similar, is that we're actually very disenfranchised from the government, in the sense that the abyss between the beehive and the small business community is massive. It's like a Grand Canyon between the two. The advisory models or whatever that the governments have used over successive years, and it's not a criticism of this government, it would be one of the more engaging I've ever seen or ever been exposed to. But the fact is, everything that's happened to date has by and large been ineffective. So rather than worry about that or criticise that, it's looking at how do we take this opportunity we've got, where we've kind of all been wiped out to a certain degree. We want to come back, we have to come back, and we have to adapt to the environment we're in. And that's where the examples of, it's gone from collaboration to cooperative thinking in private enterprise. So where a business may not have been pure play, cooperatively led, there are examples of cooperative thinking now starting to come through in the SMEs. And I think that the reality is, from a small business perspective, you know, if Stuart Nash, the Minister for Small Business, rang a small business today and said, well, what is it that you want most? That's the problem with us as a community. We're so fragmented that we're probably not great at articulating what it is that we could want most from our government. It's not their job to make us profitable or even make us a more productive or a better business. That's not their job. All their job is to create for us a level playing field that we're able to compete on, and an environment that's supportive. So some of the areas that we seek to lobby government with and try and put a fair case forward is around how we can make it easier for our business. So we are probably less likely, and when I say we, V-Formation, my company, sits on top of a database of some 57,000 SMEs. So that's been collected over my career, which started dealing with mainly the retail sector in New Zealand in 1991, and has kind of been collected through there. So they're broken up into the sectors and the size of the business, from the sole trader through to, you know, an M in the SME, and generally gleaning feedback. And by and large, you know, people are in business to make money, but the way we're going to be making money in the future is going to be different to the way we used to make it. But the problem that I see that we've got right now is that all of the political parties, quite frankly, look to me to be most likely to return to the tired old ways that we saw before COVID hit. I don't see any signs that there's any fresh thinking. Now, that's not a criticism, but what that means is that government is going to need to be led in many matters, and that's got to come from in the community. So from a small business perspective, from a Māori perspective, the ideas have to be taken to government. And all we're really looking to achieve is to have a decent three-wire bridge between that, across that Grand Canyon I talk about, where if we look at the beehive being government and the wider community out here across the country, to be able to go back and forward. I don't think you know, being inside the tent is an advantage. Being swallowed up by, you know, these big bureaucratic beasts of whether they are in the local government, whether it's a council or whatever, or MB at a central government level. You know, that's not us. We're out here in the market at the coalface doing our thing, but we need a healthy pipeline between government and here. And just touching on that, I think that that's part of where we are focused at the moment, is that because there are many what I call self-licking ice creams, these kind of entities out there, and quite happy to name them, whether they are chambers or business.org or whatever local government have them. There's not a big track record of viability coming out of a lot of those for small business and more importantly for iwi. So once again, not a criticism, it just ain't working. So what do we do about that? Well, we've got to get an ability to get the coalface down to Wellington and in front of the government, and not try and communicate through government with advisory or advocacy that's just risen too far up the food chain. And so closing the gap between the real world and government is what we are driven by. So on a daily basis, I'm communicating with a network in a community, which is just really shaping how I think, if I'm to speak, because it's not just my mouth blowing off about this, it's a reflection of the thinking across a wider community, and rechecking that. But for all of the doom and gloom that might have across it, the exciting thing about this is that we do have a clean sheet on the table. We might be broke, we might be or skint or whatever, and I've heard PGF and things like that mentioned. We're going to have to figure out a way, but the thing is that and I don't want to use the word reset, but I think that the clean sheet that we've got on a piece of paper that we've got is about the willingness from the small business community, from the Māori community, to be forthcoming and to be engaging. You know, we're not easy to get to. We're very cautious and likely to be slower to work through the process than maybe businesses with more resource. But you know, there's a very short whakatauki or Māori proverb that I love, which just goes he waka eka noa, which is basically the vehicle or the canoe on which everyone may embark. And that's how I feel we are right now, where COVID's kind of scattered us left, right and centre. We were a very fragmented community anyway. But the beauty of this is we are regrouping, we're regathering, but we're regathering with bringing fresh ideas and fresh thinking, because we're also aware that regardless of the virus, the direction that we were going for in before wasn't that great. So the virus kind of put a cloud over the top of the stars that we were navigating by. And now that cloud is starting to clear and we can see the stars again, we've got an opportunity to reset our navigation in a way that we just feel a lot better about that in terms of what's going on in our communities, and pulling in some of these things that were emerging, such as the wealth distribution and inequality. And so, you know, I think that from our perspective, we'd see an opportunity here to invite people to get involved. And so that's where V-Formation is about assembling as many people as possible, but with the objective of sending really intelligent dialogue down to Wellington and saying, we're not going to go away. We're going to continue doing this. So that's the direction that we'll be going in. That's about it from me, and look forward to taking any questions from you.
Fantastic stuff, Vaughan. Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm just thinking about the elements of government. Yes, we've come through quite a significant shift, and there's been a great deal more thought put into how we operate as a nationwide social enterprise. But this is happening under a Labour-led government. The challenges of the sector are possibly easier in this political climate than potentially if a national government was in. So I'll just pose this directly. What are your thoughts? What are our panel's thoughts in terms of the ideology between political parties as it applies to the cooperative sector?
Can I go first?
Yes, go Vaughan, yeah.
Great. I think that's a really, really good question. And, you know, having owned a small business for 9 years under the national government, And this is where, you know, I heard the word, whether it was Ashley Bloomfield or something, say the other day about an urban myth about this dude that apparently checked into a 5-star hotel. An urban myth is that the national government is great for business. Anybody that believes that obviously has owned a business or that's maybe got a monopoly or something like that. It's not true. The problem that we've got with businesses, small businesses, that the Labor government's been the most engaging government of the last 20 years for small business. But herein lies the problem. The problem the Labor government has is that they're intelligent people that are great to speak to and lay out reports and have advisory councils and boards and whatever, but their execution is crap, donut. Okay, zero. They are just not good. And I think that they would admit that themselves offline or off the record. That's where the National Party, and I've voted National 16 years in a row, so I'm entitled, 16 elections in a row, to criticise National. I've earned that the hard way. They make stuff happen, no question, but don't expect to be involved in it. You will not be. They will lock the gate and throw away the key as far as the small business community is concerned. Now, unless Todd Muller's changed his ways, and I'm keen to hear about that if he has, I certainly find this environment we're in, we're at least able to have the dialogue or the kōrero.
Thanks, Vaughan. Ros, I'd pose that out to you if it's not too contentious, and from your position there, considering that you are.
I probably have to navigate a slightly less contentious route than Vaughan. I think it's an interesting conversation to be had because there is a tendency to see co-ops as being socialistic. But we heard earlier someone was talking about the fact that actually they are ultimately there to make profits for their members. You know, there's that there is social good factors that go on within their organisations, which is the founding principles. In terms of the different governments, I think COVID is really interesting. I do agree with what Vaughan's saying in terms of getting stuff done, potentially, and that's going to be quite an interesting thing that comes through in terms of the upcoming election. So I'm watching in anticipation to see if any of the politics are coming through as different this time round. But yeah, we're in an interesting time, but I think both parties actually recognise that the model is actually, or that these organisations are going to be fundamental to the new world of doing business, and especially as we focus on achieving our UN sustainability goals. So if you look at the environment, that is going to be critical, and that's going to be one of the driving things, I think, for the upcoming election.
Thank you very much there, Ros. And we've had a question come in here, and this is from Charles Tortoise asking this. As a monolinguist English speaker, can I ask if there is a Māori word for cooperation that also has the same meaning as collaboration? And the reason being for this is there is a distinction in English between them. Oh, sorry, there is a distinction in English between them that could be significant. So I'll pass that out to the panel. Vaughan's got his hand in the air.
But I would have thought it would be katahitanga, but in terms of, you know, cohesion or working together. But I'm more than happy to, because I think that, you know, as we find, you know, with our language, you know, that one word can cover an umbrella, quite a lot of meaning. But that's where I'd go to start with. Yeah, what do the others think?
Yeah, I'd say whanaungatanga is probably the most appropriate word in te reo Māori, but I'm also conscious that it's not about sharing or trying to fit the English language. It's more around, well, how do we actually demonstrate collaboration or cooperation? But I also feel that they are stacked on other principles. And those principles, which I think are quite critical to consider, is as a collective of whānau, families, we are also deeply connected to the whenua, our land. We're also deeply connected to our hapu, our kin. And then we're also guided through aroha, which is our consideration for each other and the relationships that we hold. And surrounding that is our whakapapa, it's our connection to each other. And therefore, all of those different principles, I believe, are critical in understanding a kaupapa Māori approach to not only community development, but also the way that you might consider relating and connecting with Māori entrepreneurs and Māori in business.
Awesome.
Cool, thank you very much indeed. And I've got a question here that I'll pass through to Jackson. Has there been a shift in attitude or thinking in the capital investment space since COVID-19, for example, around investment profiles or return on investment expectations that you've seen?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's obviously quite early days to really know the answer of that. I think there's been a couple of things happen though, as will be no surprise. In some countries, particularly those that are still going through the depths of this crisis, the appetite to make investments has significantly reduced. So we've seen across a variety of different sectors or asset classes within investment that the appetite to make investments has almost stopped. In New Zealand, I think we've been relatively lucky generally in the way we've managed this, and so therefore there is still a lot of investment going on here. But the theme I've certainly seen across it all is more scrutiny, I guess, put on things because there's a higher risk aversion, because we're all a bit more concerned around how volatile the world is. So there's still investors out there with capital looking to invest. They're being a lot more cautious, I think, in how they're investing that. But the upside of all of that for cooperatives and impact-oriented organisations generally is, I think, what COVID has done is put a magnifying glass, if you like, on the importance and the value of the sector. When times are tough, in your local communities, it wouldn't have been the purely profit-oriented organisation that people were looking to support. It was the organisation that supported the community in some broader way, as well as making money. Those are the organisations that their priority and their importance has been heightened through this crisis. So I think the offshoot of that for investment is long-term investors. It's enabled them to more clearly see the value of cooperatives and other impact-oriented structures. So I hope longer term, it will mean more impact investment activity because of COVID.
So with that in mind, how do you prime an investor to move from being more about as an angel investor or working on ROI into impact investment? What can we do to create a mind shift in that kind of investor?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll make a small comment, but I'm sure lots on the panel can add. And that ultimately this comes down to impact, I think, and the understanding and valuing and fluency of knowing impact and knowing that that is a really sensible way for the world to operate and prioritize for significantly more so than purely profit, for example. And importantly in New Zealand, it's how business in New Zealand started with Māori business was all about supporting the community. So it's revaluing what has been lost over time. Well, so not lost at all, but deprioritized, I guess, through lots of things. So I would say the more people understand impact, the more clear it is for them to think, actually, this is the way to go about it, as well as having case studies of success with impact investment funds that are happening and making viable, profitable, impactful investments. I think these are all starting to make a pretty clear case that impact investment is a really sensible thing.
And Greg, can I just pick up on that?
Please,
so
Stephen, yeah.
I have another hat, which is I'm the chair of a company called Community Finance. So we've just finished raising $15 million for social housing, and the investors are philanthropic. Normally they would be grant makers, but they've actually invested in this structure. And the way that we've gone about explaining it is, well, it actually works in our favor. Look at the interest rate you would get if you go to the bank. What's the percentage you're going to get? And what's the return you can get through having an investment where you're actually making a similar amount, but you have all these extra layers of impact. So in our case, we're helping build social housing. So it's clean, green, efficient, newly built homes. It's people stable, providing employment. The children are going back to school, they're in one place, they're not moving around. So there's all these extra flow-on impacts, which is way beyond the interest rate that you're making. And if you can explain it to people like that, the key word, as Jackson says, is impact. And then all of a sudden the lights do go on. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of interest and there is a lot of money still out there and people want to use it well. And part of the thing we've realized is e waka e ke noa, we're all in it together. And people are coming around to this idea that they need to better use their money rather than putting it with banks, which are owned by Australian entities, actually investing local, keep it here. So I'm seeing it as a huge opportunity, but it is about education and people like Jackson and the work he's doing and others. If we all tell our stories, it will combined have a really big impact.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. That's pretty much all the time, and a perfect moment to actually just sort of round us out. An hour goes extremely swiftly when we're delving into things that create a great deal of passion for all of us, and would love to see this extended. This really has been designed as a catalyst to be able to start those conversations out within our communities as well. Within the chat section here of the webinar, you'll find some resources as well and some connection points. Please do feel free to connect with all of our presenters, and of course with Ross McTaggart, who from Core Enterprise Group, who has had the initiative to put this on for us as well. So a huge thank you to Kay Marie Dunn, Jackson Rowland, Stephen Moe, Ros Henry and Vaughan Winiata and Ross McTaggart. I'm Greg Ward. It just remains for me to say, api hono, tātai hono, rātou te hunga mate, kia rātou, tātou te hunga ora, kia tātou. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa.